The ice in Genevieve's glass didn't even rattle as she watched the man she called husband press a stranger into the velvet wallpaper of the gallery's private wing. Zerion's ink, those jagged dark lines she'd traced 1,000 times, looked like iron shackles under the dim lights. He didn't see her. He was too consumed by a conquest that cost him nothing. Genevieve didn't shatter the glass. She didn't demand an audience. She simply set the drink on a passing tray, slipped her wedding band into a bowl of decorative stones, and stepped into the night. By the time the sun hit the skyline, Genevieve Okoye was a ghost, and the accounts Zerion thought he owned were beginning to bleed. The silence of the gallery corridor was more absolute than any shout could have been. Genevieve moved with a rhythmic, steady stride, her heels striking the polished marble with the precision of a metronome. There was no tremor in her hands as she reached the heavy bronze doors of the exit. She didn't look back to see if the shadows shifted, or if he had finally noticed the vacuum her absence created. To Zerion, she was a fixture, as permanent and silent as the foundation of his estate. He had forgotten that foundations are the first thing to shift before a structure collapses. Outside, the air was sharp, smelling of damp stone and the metallic tang of the coming winter. She didn't summon the driver. To use the black sedan was to remain within the orbit of the park syndicate, a satellite tethered to his gravity. Instead, she stepped into a waiting car that didn't belong to his fleet, its engine a low, unfamiliar hum that signaled the start of a different life. As the vehicle pulled away, she pulled a slim burner device from her clutch. With 3 taps, she activated the blackout script she'd written 6 months ago, a contingency plan she'd hoped she would never need. On the screen, lines of crimson code flickered, systematically severing her digital identity from his. Her location, her cloud backups, and the encrypted logistics maps she'd built for his shipping empire began to dissolve into unrecoverable noise. She watched the city lights smear into long golden streaks against the window. She wasn't grieving the man. She was mourning the time she'd spent making him untouchable. For 2 years, she had been the ghost in his machine, the intelligence that turned his brutality into a legacy. Now the machine was going to have to learn how to breathe without its lungs. Genevieve leaned her head back against the cool leather seat, her expression as unreadable as the dark water of the harbour they were passing. The betrayal hadn't broken her heart. It had merely cleared her vision. Zerion Cade Park believed he was the hunter, but as the final byte of data deleted itself, Genevieve knew the truth. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the only person who knew exactly where his armor was thin. The transition was surgical. While the car wound through the service tunnels beneath the city's heart, Genevieve's thumbs moved with a cold, rhythmic intent. She wasn't just deleting photos or blocking a number. She was amputating a version of herself that no longer had a right to exist. Every shared server, every encrypted cloud where she had stored the blueprints of Zerion's expansion, flickered once and turned to ash. She watched the progress bars slide toward completion, the light from the screen casting a pale bluish tint over her high cheekbones. Behind her, in the plush, velvet-lined heat of the gallery, Zerion was likely still tangled in a stranger's perfume, oblivious to the fact that the invisible scaffolding of his life was being dismantled. He had always relied on her presence as a constant, a quiet luxury he could return to once the adrenaline of his darker impulses faded. He didn't realize that Genevieve was the one who managed the friction of his world. She was the reason his accounts remained invisible to federal eyes, and why his shipments moved through ports like shadows. A notification pulsed. Access revoked. The joint bank accounts, the ones he used for the estate's upkeep, were now locked in a legal labyrinth that would take his best lawyers weeks to unspool. The biometric locks on their private residence would no longer recognize the ridge of his thumb. She had even triggered the remote wipe on the tablet he kept by his bedside, the one containing the tactical maps for the upcoming merger. She felt a strange, hollow lightness in her chest. It wasn't the frantic heartbeat of a woman in flight, but the steady pulse of a captain abandoning a sinking ship she had built herself. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small metallic canister. Inside was a chemical compound designed to degrade magnetic strips. She slid her primary credit cards through the slot, watching the black tape curl and blister, rendered useless. The car slowed as it reached a nondescript transit hub. Genevieve stepped out, her movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. She didn't look at the driver, and the driver didn't look at her. She was now a ghost in the system, a blank space where a powerhouse used to be. As she walked toward the boarding gate of a private charter, she dropped her wedding edition phone into a deep concrete trash bin. It was still ringing, Zerion's name flashing on the screen like a dying star. She didn't check to see if it hit the bottom. She simply kept walking, her silhouette merging with the grey fog of the early morning, leaving the man who thought he owned her to wake up in a kingdom that no longer knew his name. The heavy reinforced doors of the estate didn't yield to Zerion's biometric scan. He stared at the red glow of the sensor, a flicker of irritation tightening his jaw. It took 3 tries before he realized the system wasn't malfunctioning, it had simply forgotten him. When he finally forced entry through the manual override, the air that met him was dead. There was no lingering trace of the expensive citrus oil Genevieve favored, nor the faint, warm musk of her skin. The house felt like a museum closed for the season, stripped of its soul and climate-controlled into a sterile void. He moved through the foyer, his footsteps echoing against the marble like gunshots. He expected to find her in the library, perhaps draped over the chaise with the tablet in hand, her silence a sharp weapon he'd have to blunt with a practiced apology. But the library was a shell. The shelves where her leather-bound journals usually sat were vacant, leaving behind nothing but pale rectangles of dust. Even the air felt filtered, as if a specialized cleaning crew had moved through the vents to suck out the very molecules of her presence. In the master suite, the vacuum was even more absolute. He pulled open the walk-in closet, expecting the usual soft rustle of her silk gowns or the structured silhouette of her blazers. Instead, he was met with an expanse of empty hangers that rattled in the draft he'd created. She hadn't just packed a suitcase, she had performed an exorcism. There were no stray hairpins on the vanity, no discarded earrings in the velvet trays. He reached for the bedside carafe, but even the water had been emptied, the glass polished to a taunting shine. Zerion stood in the center of the room, the silence beginning to ring in his ears. He looked down at his hands, the dark ink of the dragons on his skin feeling heavy, like lead. For the first time in a decade, the man who owned the city felt like a trespasser in his own home. He walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling ground she had designed, only to see the security lights flickering out one by one. She hadn't just left him a house of ash. She had pulled the plug on his entire reality. He went to call his head of security, but the house's internal network hissed with a dial tone that sounded like a funeral dirge. Genevieve hadn't left a note, a scent, or a shadow. She had simply erased the world they built, leaving him standing in the cold remains of a kingdom that didn't recognize its king. The emergency line didn't ring. It pulsed with a low, flat tone that signaled a catastrophic breach. Zerion sat in his command chair, the lever cool against his back, as his lead technician's face appeared on the monitor. The man's skin was a sickly shade of grey, his eyes darting across a screen that was hemorrhaging red data points.
"The northern corridor is gone, boss," the technician stuttered, his voice thin. "The tankers in the strait have dropped off the grid. Their GPS signatures are ghosting. We can't reach the captains, and the automated manifest system just locked us out." Zerion didn't move. He watched a digital map of the world's oceans, where the pulsing blue icons representing his wealth were flickering and vanishing like dying embers. These weren't just ships. They were the arteries of his empire, carrying the cargo that bought his seat at every table. Within seconds, the Western Mediterranean route followed, the encrypted keys to the port authorities resetting to a configuration his team had never seen. He finally understood. Genevieve hadn't just been his wife. She had been the architect of his invisibility. She had spent years weaving a digital shroud around his operations, a complex web of redirection and ghost servers that only she could navigate. By removing herself, she hadn't just walked out of her door. She had collapsed the tunnels he used to move through the world. "Override it," Zerion commanded, his voice a jagged edge in the silent room. "We can't," the tech whispered, a bead of sweat tracing the line of his headset. "The encryption isn't just changed, it's evolving. Every time we try a backdoor, the system rewrites itself. It's using a logic bridge you must have built months ago. It's not a lock, sir. It's a suicide pill." Zerion leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen where his billion-dollar logistics network was turning into a graveyard of dead links. He thought of her hands, the way they had moved so gracefully over his skin, the same hands that had been quietly wiring his downfall while he was distracted by the trivial. She had known the exact moment his arrogance would peak, and she had timed this digital execution with the cold precision of a professional hit. The room grew dark as the secondary servers shut down to prevent a total melt. In the gloom, the glow of the failing monitors cast long, distorted shadows across his face. He wasn't just losing money. He was losing the ability to see his own kingdom. Without those roots, he was just a man in a suit with a collection of useless steel. Genevieve had taken the keys, the maps, and the light, leaving him to navigate the wreckage of a reign she had essentially gifted him, and now, just as easily, revoked. The conference room was a vacuum of frantic energy, but Zerion sat at the head of the table in a state of icy, focused stillness. His financial advisors were a blur of nervous motion, their tablets glowing with the jagged lines of a market that had turned predatory. The Park Syndicate's shell companies, the intricate layers of insulation he used to move legitimate capital, were being systematically picked apart. It wasn't a hostile takeover in the traditional sense. It was a harvest. "Who is Nova Prime Logistics?" Zerion's voice was a low, dangerous rasp that cut through the chatter. His CFO adjusted his glasses, his fingers trembling as he pulled up the filing. "We don't know, sir. It's a blind trust registered in a jurisdiction that doesn't cooperate with our usual channels. They aren't attacking our assets. They're buying our debt. Every short-term loan, every high-interest credit line we used to bridge the gap after the shipping routes went dark. They've snapped it all up in the last 6 hours." Zerion watched the screen. The strategy was flawless. By owning the debt, this ghost entity wasn't just a rival. They were becoming his landlord. They held the power to call in the loans at any moment, a move that would trigger a domino effect of liquidations he couldn't stop. He leaned back, his gaze lingering on the empty chair to his right, the seat where Genevieve used to sit, her presence a silent, stabilizing force. She would have seen this coming. She would have already planted a counter-virus or negotiated a buyout before the first contract was even signed.
They're moving with inside knowledge, the CFO continued, unaware of the internal ghost Zerion was wrestling with. They knew exactly which shells were vulnerable. They're bypassing our defensive triggers like they don't even exist. The realization hit Zerion not as a shock, but as a dull, heavy weight. This wasn't a stranger. No outside firm could navigate the labyrinth of the Park Syndicate with this kind of surgical familiarity. This investor knew the pressure points because they had helped build the skeleton. He looked at the buy orders, each one timed to the second, each one executed with a ruthless efficiency that lacked the desperation of a typical corporate raid. It was a signature written in numbers. While he had been hunting for her in the shadows of the city, Genevieve had moved into the light of the high finance world, using the very wealth he thought he controlled to buy the rope he was now standing on. She wasn't hiding, she was scaling. He realized then that she didn't want his apology or his head. She wanted his signature on a surrender document she hadn't even bothered to send yet. The man who owned the board was slowly realizing he was now just another piece being moved. The glass and steel monolith of the Zenith Financial Center didn't belong to the underworld Zerion commanded. It was a cathedral of legitimate power, a place where the air was filtered and the stakes were measured in basis points rather than blood. Zerion stood in the shadow of the lobby's marble pillars, his presence a dark stain on the pristine floor. He had spent 3 days chasing a digital breadcrumb, a recurring maintenance fee for a high-security suite that didn't appear on any of his firm's ledgers. He had expected to find a safe house or a hidden server. He hadn't expected to find a stage. The private elevator chime was a soft, musical note that cut through the low hum of the lobby. When the doors slid open, it wasn't a technician or a nervous analyst who stepped out. It was Genevieve. She was draped in a tailored, bone-white coat that made her deep brown skin glow with a startling, regal clarity. Her hair was pulled back into a sharp, architectural knot, and her movements were devoid of the quiet deference she had once worn like a veil. She didn't look like a woman in hiding. She looked like the person who owned the air everyone else was breathing. But it was the men flanking her that caused the ghost of a scar on Zerion's eyebrow to twitch. Walking half a step behind her were the heads of the Vane and Thorn conglomerates, Zerion's oldest rivals, men who had spent a decade trying to find a crack in the Park Syndicate's armor. They weren't escorting her, they were following her, their expressions a mix of wary respect and uncharacteristic eagerness. One of them held a leather portfolio open for her, pointing to a signature line with a submissiveness that turned Zerion's stomach. Genevieve stopped near the revolving doors, the afternoon light catching the sharp angle of her jaw. She didn't scan the room with the frantic energy of the hunted. Instead, her gaze swept across the lobby with a calm, predatory grace. For a heartbeat, her eyes collided with Zerion's. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. There was no hitch in her breathing, no flicker of the wife who used to wait for his return. Her expression remained as cool and impenetrable as the sapphire glass above them. She offered him nothing but a brief, microscopic inclination of her head, a greeting one might give a passing acquaintance or a former employee. Then, she turned back to the Vane CEO, offering a sharp, decisive nod that sent the men scurrying toward their waiting cars. Zerion took a step forward, his hand reflexively reaching for a phone that no longer had her number. But the security detail at the elevators, men who used to be on his payroll, stepped into his path with cold, professional indifference. Genevieve walked out into the sun, her silhouette sharp and untouchable, leaving Zerion to realize that the meetings he thought he was tracking weren't about his downfall. They were about her ascent. He wasn't her target anymore. He was just the rubble she had stepped over on her way to the top. The ink on the emergency injunction was barely dry when Zerion slammed it onto the mahogany desk of his private banker. He didn't need a court date. He needed a kill switch. His eyes were bloodshot, the sharp features of his face hollowed out by 72 hours of chasing a woman who seemed to be evaporating into the very infrastructure of the city. "Freeze everything," Zerion commanded, his voice a low, vibrating friction. "Every offshore holding, every discretionary fund, every cent linked to Genevieve Okoye. I want her penniless by sunset." The banker, a man who had laundered millions for the Park family without blinking, didn't move to the terminal. He sat with his hands folded, his face a mask of professional mourning. "We can't, Zerion. There's nothing left to freeze." Zerion's hand tightened on the edge of the desk, the wood grain groaning under the pressure. "I checked the balances myself last week. The liquidity in the Cayman accounts alone could fund a small military." "It's gone," the banker whispered, sliding a tablet across the surface. "It wasn't stolen. It was reclassified." 24 hours before she left the gallery, a series of standing orders were executed. She didn't transfer the money to herself. That would have been too easy to track, too easy to litigate. She moved the entire liquid core of the Park Syndicate into a blind charitable trust dedicated to urban infrastructure and tech logistics development.
Zerion stared at the screen. The numbers were there, but they were shielded by a legal thicket of ironclad, dead man switches and irrevocable clauses. Genevieve hadn't just taken his money. She had laundered it into a fortress of legitimacy. Because the trust was structured as a non-profit entity with a board of directors that included his own rivals, any attempt to claw it back would trigger a federal audit that would strip the syndicate bare. "She's listed as the primary consultant for the trust's deployment," the banker continued, his voice dropping an octave. "She's essentially spending your own war chest to build the very system she's using to replace you. You're literally funding her takeover, Zerion. Every office she rents, every programmer she hires, it's all on your dime." The silence that followed was suffocating. Zerion looked at the scar on his hand, the one he'd gotten protecting a shipment that had laid the foundation for this wealth. He had thought Genevieve was a passenger in his life, a beautiful ornament to his power. But she had been the one holding the ledger, and she had spent years ensuring that when the time came, the king would be left with a crown of glass and an empty vault. He wasn't just losing a wife. He was watching her use his own sword to cut the ground out from under his feet. He reached for his phone to call his enforcers, only to realize the service had been cut. The bill hadn't been paid. Even his connection to the world was now a line item she had chosen to delete. The plaza was a sprawling expanse of white granite and tiered fountains, a neutral stage where the wind carried the scent of wet stone and nothing else. Zerion stood by the central basin, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a dark wool coat. He had sent the message through 3 different intermediaries, a desperate flare launched into a sky she now controlled. He expected her to arrive with a phalanx of security, a display of the new walls she had built. Instead, Genevieve walked toward him alone, her stride unhurried, draped in a structured, navy blue trench coat that made her look like a part of the horizon. She stopped 10 feet away. There were no weapons between them, no hidden blades or silent enforcers in the shadows. The air was thin and bitingly cold, but she didn't shiver. She simply looked at him,
her eyes reflecting the grey sky with a clarity that made Zarion feel suddenly, sharply visible. "You've had your fun, Genevieve," Zarion said, his voice a low command he'd used 1,000 times to end the rebellion. "The point is made. The board is a mess. Now call off the buyouts, unlock the trust, and come home. We can renegotiate the terms of your position, but this theatrics ends today." He stepped toward her, his shadow lengthening across the granite. He reached out, his fingers twitching as if to reclaim the space around her, to re-establish the gravity he believed he still possessed. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you that the park name isn't something you can just resign from." Genevieve didn't recoil. She didn't even blink. Instead, a sound escaped her, a soft, dry ripple of amusement that wasn't a giggle or a sneer. It was a genuine laugh, one that seemed to vibrate with the sheer absurdity of his words. The sound was more devastating than any slap. It was the sound of a woman who had realized the monster in her closet was actually just a shadow. "You're still talking to the woman who used to fold your laundry, Zarion," she said, the laughter fading into a calm, terrifying pity. "You're giving orders to a ghost. The woman who belonged to the park name died the second you touched someone else in that gallery. The woman standing here, she owns your debt. She owns your logistics. And by next Tuesday, she'll own the ground your headquarters is built on." She took a single step closer, her presence so dense and absolute that Zarion found his own breath stalling. She didn't smell like the expensive citrus he remembered. She smelled like nothing at all. Pure, sterile autonomy. "I didn't come here to negotiate," she whispered, her voice like a razor through silk. "I came to see if you actually believed you still had a voice in my world. It's fascinating, really. You're a king without a kingdom, still trying to command the rain." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a steady, mocking rhythm against the stone. She didn't look back to see him standing there, his hands still frozen in midair, a man trying to grasp a wind that had already passed him by. The auction for the Central Port Authority wasn't held in a back room with smoke and whispered threats. It was a clinical execution broadcast on a digital ticker in the city's High Court Annex. Zarion sat in the front row, his knuckles white against the charcoal fabric of his trousers. This was the pulse of his survival. Whoever controlled the birthing rites controlled the movement of every crate, every untraceable shadow, and every ounce of leverage he had left. He had liquidated his remaining private holdings, scraped the bottom of his hidden reserves, and authorized a bid that should have ended the conversation. The gavel hovered. The silence in the room was heavy, smelling of floor wax and the static of a dozen cooling servers. "The bid stands at 480 million, the auctioneer announced, his voice devoid of the gravity Zarion felt in his marrow. Zarion allowed himself a single shallow breath. It was more than the Thorn family could pivot in a week. It was more than the Vanes could liquidize without a board vote. He had won the ground back. He could smell the victory, bitter, expensive, and desperate. Then, the monitor flickered. A new number scrolled across the LED display, glowing a cool, predatory blue. 525 million. The air in Zarion's lungs turned to lead. He didn't need to look at the bidder's console to know the source. The entity was Nova Prime, the same ghost that had been eating his debt like a cancer. He turned his head slowly, his gaze finding Genevieve in the back of the gallery. She wasn't sitting. She was leaning against a marble pillar, a tablet cradled in one arm. She wore a sharp, copper-toned silk suit that seemed to catch the morning light, making her look like a bronze statue come to life. She didn't look at the auctioneer. She didn't look at the board. She looked directly at Zarion, her thumb hovering over the glass screen of her device. It was a silent, public execution. She wasn't just outbidding him. She was using the very trust she had built from his stolen wealth to buy the one thing he needed to breathe. Going once, the auctioneer's voice cracked the stillness. Zarion stood up, his chair scraping the floor with a jagged, desperate sound. He opened his mouth to protest, to claim a foul, to demand a stay, but the words died in his throat. Genevieve offered a microscopic, chilling smile, not of triumph, but of finality. She tapped the screen one last time, raising her own bid by another 10 million just to prove she could. Sold to Nova Prime Logistics. The sound of the gavel was the closing of a coffin lid. The room erupted into a low hum of shocked murmurs, but Genevieve simply tucked her tablet under her arm and turned toward the exit. She had just stripped him of his docs, his roots, and his future. As she stepped into the hallway, she didn't look back at the man who used to own the city. He was no longer a player. He was just a tenant in a world she had spent the morning buying. The penthouse air was thin and perfectly still, filtered of the grit and noise of the streets below. Genevieve stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, her reflection ghosting over the sprawling grid of the city. In the distance, the port she now owned was a hive of motion, the cranes bowing like giant iron servants as they moved her cargo. She wore a robe of heavy, deep plum velvet that felt like armor against the twilight. In her hand, she held a small, velvet-lined box that had been delivered to her desk an hour ago. Inside was the wedding ring she had dropped into a bowl of stones weeks ago. Zarion had found it. He had kept it. And now he had sent it back. A silent, desperate plea for a world that no longer existed. She turned the gold band over in her palm. It felt light, insignificant, like a piece of a puzzle for a game she had finished playing. To Zarion, this circle represented a bond, a possession, a territory he could reclaim. To her, it was just metal. She walked to the edge of her terrace, where the wind finally reached her, tugging at the hem of her robe. Below, the city light flickered, a carpet of diamonds she had spent her life weaving for a man who didn't know how to appreciate the craft. A soft chime echoed from her console. A notification appeared. The final mortgage on the Park Syndicate's headquarters had been transferred to her holding company. She was officially his landlord. She was the one who signed the checks for his security, the one who controlled the flow of his electricity, and the one who held the keys to the very room where he currently sat in the dark. Genevieve didn't feel the rush of heat that comes with revenge. She felt the cool, expansive clarity of sovereignty. She had outgrown the role of a shadow. She had become the light that cast it. She looked at the ring one last time, noting the small inscription inside that she used to think was a promise. Then, with a movement as effortless as a breath, she let it slip from her fingers. She didn't watch it fall. She didn't wait for the sound of it hitting the concrete 60 stories down. She turned her back on the edge and walked toward her desk, the soft glow of her monitors illuminating a new set of blueprints. The man who once thought he owned her was now just a line item in her ledger, a debt she would choose to collect or ignore at her leisure. Genevieve Okoye sat down, adjusted her sleeves, and began to build the rest of the world.